we don't have any interference from other people's mics. We are recording this session, so for if any reason you have to leave, we will be able to make the video of this available to you afterwards, which you can then share with your colleagues if you'd like to. If you're having any technical difficulties, please do let us know just in the question or the chat functionality. And like I said, there should be documents there in the handout section that you're able to look at too. But all of this information is on the NALA website, the 3 documents, indeed our press release as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to our CEO, Dr. Inez Bailey, who's going to just talk you through the program and the format for this morning and what we're doing here today. So thanks again.
Great, thank you, Claire, and good morning from me to everybody. As Claire has mentioned, we're launching today 3 reports that we've been working on over the last 18 months, really inspired by our desire to inform a new approach to addressing adult literacy, numeracy and digital skills. And what we are hoping to do today, I suppose, is start a conversation which we hope will flow into the Programme for Government commitment that we have seen, which is clearly giving a kind of a strong statement to develop a new 10-year strategy for adult literacy, numeracy and digital skills within the first year of the government, which we were really, really pleased to see, because obviously alongside of that 18-month work in putting those reports together, we have been lobbying hard for this new idea of a different approach, building on, I suppose, the success and the work that has been achieved by many stakeholders to date. Just to note, we also got a commitment to the whole area of plain language, another area we've been lobbying hard for. So we were also really, really pleased to see a commitment to that in the Programme for Government. Our programme really then today is sort of a brief introduction to the 3 reports and an opportunity then for some of our key stakeholders to give an initial response to them. It's very, very early days in relation to this piece of work, obviously with the Programme for Government only weeks old. So we're really appreciative already of the support that we've been getting, both from the stakeholders who are with us today, but also the Minister, Simon Harris, Minister in the new Department of Further and Higher Education, who has already lined up a meeting with us to discuss this further. So we're really pleased that we can kind of finish off at one level this piece of work from the NALA side and hand it over into the wider stakeholder group, who we very much hope will then take it forward. I suppose our programme then for today is made up of 2 kind of keynote speakers. So Helen Ryan is our policy officer, and Helen is going to talk about 2 of the reports. The first report really deals with the current state of play, the policy and practice in Ireland, the current statistics, and a contemporary picture really of what's going on in many other European countries and internationally in relation to addressing adult literacy, numeracy and digital skills. So that's a really interesting, I suppose, compilation of the most contemporary information on this area being brought together as a kind of a really solid background document from which to work from. Then we will have Dr. Shaina Chan talking about a piece of work that we asked TASK, the think tank for action on social change, to conduct on our behalf. And really what we were trying to achieve in working with TASK was this idea of what would or what could be a new approach that might inform this new strategy. And we went to TASK with an idea around having a wider perspective, a wider picture on literacy, maybe beyond maybe the more narrow view of just education in itself, and should be talking a little bit about some of the work that they have contributed now to thinking differently maybe about adult literacy, numeracy and digital skills and a new strategy. We'll then have an opportunity to go to some of the stakeholders who have kindly agreed just to give initial comments to us. So we have stakeholders from the Departments of Further and Higher Education, Departments of Social Protection, the Department of Community and Rural Development, and also SOLAS. So we'll be coming to them later. And we have asked people to feel free to log any comments or questions they have in the chat function, and one of my colleagues will try and summarise those at a later point. So I think that gives us a kind of a quick overview of what we're trying to do today. So I've explained the 3 documents. I left the 3rd one out, so maybe I'll just go back to it. Helen will include it, but it's a smaller document that really just is concerned with looking at what an outcomes framework for measuring the impact of a new strategy might look like. So we can talk a little bit about that. So I think if I have given a sufficient context for our brief webinar this morning, I might just hand over now to my colleague, Helen Ryan, who is going to take us through 2 of the reports, Literacy Now in particular, and a small piece just in relation to the outcomes framework. And then we'll move on to Shaina, who's going to take over the Literacy for Life document. So I'll hand over to you, Helen.
Great, Inez, thank you very much. So I'm just going to talk very briefly for a couple of minutes about the 2 reports, as Inez said, and in particular Literacy Now. And it's available online, and as we said, it's in the handout section as well. So this report, really, the main purpose was to gather the evidence that is out there to show why we need to support adults with literacy and numeracy needs. And we broke it really into the three parts. We're going to look at the statistics and research, and I have a slide looking at that now, and some of the current policy and practice as well, and then really looking at why we need to do more around this area. So we have looked at some of the facts, and these will be familiar to lots of people, but again, there's no harm. There are sometimes in our work we come across people who can be quite shocked at some of the information and some of the stats. So it's important to remind people that the statistics out there show that 1 in 6 adults, this is from the PIAC survey, struggle with reading and understanding basic text. So if we think about the current pandemic and coronavirus situation we've been in, that has meant that many adults, when we all got that nice brochure in the door from the government around what we needed to do, that 1 in 6 adults would have struggled with reading and fully understanding that text. So we have to, that's a huge issue for us to look at. We also see that we have a numeracy statistic, which is in there. Again, people may be familiar with this, which is that 1 in 4 adults will struggle with basic numeracy information. And again, this can help really looking at how a lot of parents who again would have rung us would struggle with some of these issues when they were working with their children, and their numeracy is another angle on that. So we also, in it, we have literacy changes lives. We looked very much in the report around all of these elements in our life where literacy impacts, and it is around that health and well-being. Work comes into it, and we'll be looking at that, and accessing further education and training as well. And I mentioned family there a minute ago. And we use literacy, I suppose our definition in NALA of literacy is that we use these skills every minute of every day of our lives. And it isn't just the functional levels, it also comes with other elements around that. So it's important. We have written that up, and it is in the report in more detail. Big issue at the minute for everyone is this digital divide and the digital skills. And again, looking at the statistics there, we know that 42% of Irish adults struggle very much with using technology in everyday life. And we, if you can imagine, a lot of the information that we all accessed around, again, this current crisis would have been online. We were able to go and check information out, and for many adults, they would have struggled with that. So it's a particular area, I think, that the new strategy is linking the adult literacy, numeracy, and digital skills do go together in that way. And then finally, the report looking at current policy. So there are lots of policies out there. The Department of Education and Skills has a commitment to this. SULLA's had a strategy on it, and they've been working on it, and they've a new one just released last week. And that in the last year there, in 2019, that there were 65,000 adults who attended services around the country. So the ETBs, the Education and Training Boards, deliver free adult literacy services where adults can access between 2 and 6 hours a week. When we work out the figures on that, we would say that it's a great service, but it is only catering for 12.5%. And we would like to see that expanded and increased if we really want to meet a lot of our international targets that are laid down. So why do we need to address this? And this is, again, the report looks very much at literacy being a barometer of equality. So we took evidence. It's very much an evidence-based report, looked at what's happening international And we know that equal societies are happier, healthier and wealthier, and that adult education is a really good thing to do. So improving these skills has a huge impact, not just on the individual, but also on their health, their well-being, their family, their ability to access work, to stay in work, to go for promotions. And in fact, you know, the ability to be a citizen, being able to vote and participate fully in society. So really, in a nutshell, we say literacy changes lives. And we would have, over the years, if anyone was listening to Morning Ireland this morning, you may have heard Michael speak about how literacy and going back to learning has changed his life around what he can do. So we have lots of these, Eamon, Christine here, Geraldine and Tony. We have many of our learners and our student ambassadors over the years have been great promoters of why it's important to go back to learning. Always when I read these and I listen to the stories, very moved, and really reminds us why we're doing this work. So for Eamon, it was very much about his children and reading the stories to his kids. And when we look and we talk to Geraldine, she felt that when she went back, you know, was I too old? You're never too old to learn, and how brave a step it is for people. And fear can be a big issue. Tony would have spoken a lot about that fear. But once you go back and you get on it and you get your digital skills and you can move on and do that, it actually is an amazing achievement for people and really does change their lives. So then finally, when we were moving then towards the end of the report and we were looking, what we wanted to look at how we could move it forward, really when you look at where literacy is in our life, and I've mentioned the financial and the health and the family a minute ago, that it actually impacts around 9 government departments would do some work around literacy, numeracy and digital skills. And we have those 9 departments outlined there. And that really was when you looked at that, was the motivation for looking at why we needed to look at literacy in a broader approach. And at this idea, what would you be talking about in the next report when Shaina talks in a few minutes. So the other report that we looked at, and was again, it's great, you have our background report, which is Literacy Now. We'll hear about Literacy for Life in a minute. But then there was also really useful to go and do a report around how do we measure this. And this report was done by Jackie Borge and Daniel Sellers from Scotland. And they looked at the report in identifying indicators to measure the outcomes. And again, which was really interesting, when you looked at the outcomes categories, there are all those things we spoke about a minute ago, or I was speaking about: the educational, the life-wide, the societal and economic. And it is important that when we go back to learning, that we assess learning and measure learning in a broader way than perhaps just how many people showed up, how far did they get, what certificate did they get, that we need to look at it from a broader concept. And this was the domains wheel that we use, putting the learner at the centre. A learner always goes at the centre of all the work. And then around that, we look at all of the impact that literacy and numeracy and digital skills can have on people. And it's a meaty report. It's a short report, as Ina said. It's only about 40 pages, but at the back there's a lot of appendices which go into this detail around this. And we hope that this report, in particular, when the department and Sullus are looking at how they are going to track and monitor this, that this report, we hope, will be very useful for them. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Helen. That's fantastic. A brief summary there about the 2 documents so far. And just to draw your attention as attendees, we do have those documents available as handouts. So hopefully people can see them as handouts on their screen. If not, obviously they are on our website, and certainly if anybody has any difficulty, please contact us. We can give them to you. So that's great. Thank you very much, Helen. We'll now move on to Dr. Shaina Chan, who, as I said, is the CEO of the think tank for action on social change known as TASK. And Shaina has been working with us for about 18 months, and we were very interested, I suppose, to work with TASK because we're doing a lot of very interesting work, wider perspectives, different perspectives on a range of socioeconomic areas. And Shaina brings a lot of experience from other countries, most recently, I think, the UK, which we've been very interested to hear about that. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Shaina.
Thank you, Inez, and thank you, Helen. It's been great to work with you, and thank you for approaching task to do this work. And I'm going to speak very briefly today about the approach that's outlined in the report that we drafted with Nala that is up there for you to download. I'm going to just talk about sort of the approach itself, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask afterwards. So I should say that the approach was developed pre-pandemic, but I think that the issues that are raised within the report, particularly the concept of resilience, are quite critical, even more critical now as we work through the pandemic and the recession that it has caused. I'd say that faced with numerous short and long-term challenges, the government, as well as the private and charity sectors, are going to have to focus on how to prepare the population for future external shocks. And what I would say would be necessary changes in livelihoods and lifestyles, not just because of the pandemic and the recession and social distancing, but also because eventually climate change. I know that people from the government and most of the population knows this, but over the next year in Ireland, we face a public health crisis, the recession, tensions within the EU over the rule of law and financial support, and the probability of a hard Brexit. Even if Boris Johnson elects to prolong the transition period for Brexit, this doesn't mean that Brexit's going to be avoided forever. So beyond the known challenges, we also, as I've just mentioned, have climate change, which is going to have an impact on our weather and our bills in the agricultural sector, water supplies, and so on. So in that sort of dramatic scenario, I'm going to focus on talking about why literacy is important, but also why there needs to be an all-of-government approach to looking at literacy that's different from just a policy objective. Are numbers in themselves. Ireland's a small open economy and we are reliant on foreign direct investment. Ireland depends upon its human capital for productivity and growth. So the argument here is in a world where leaders are becoming more protectionist and domestic concerns are orienting investments, we have to think about how Ireland is going to protect its own economy and its population, knowing that human capital is quite critical to growth in Ireland. Now, Ireland's participation rate in higher education is relatively high, and I'm not going to go over the statistics because Helen just did a great job in doing that. But there are other indicators I am going to mention beyond literacy. So as you've seen that Ireland there's some critical literacy figures that are important to look at. But beyond literacy, you also have an issue with the productivity rate for SMEs, and this is pre-pandemic and pre the crisis that they're facing now because of the lockdown and the loss of demand for their products. The productivity rate for SMEs pre-pandemic was substantially lower than other small open economies in Europe, like the Netherlands. The economy overall also depends not just on FDI or foreign direct investment, but it depends on these low wage, low value added sectors like hospitality, where you've had a number of people laid off. So the question isn't going to be sort of, will they return to those jobs? It could be that those industries change substantially. So again, literacy becomes important as a policy issue because those people will have to find different kinds of jobs and they have to have the baseline skills in order to acquire those jobs, which may not even be developed or created yet. But it's important that they have the base skills in order to, as we saw from the quotes, to go back to school, to educate, to know how to make good decisions. So the alternative approach, which I'm very briefly going to outline here, is embedded in the relationship between literacy, numeracy, and digital literacy, which are the categories of literacy that Helen referred to, and the concept of resilience. So literacy relates directly to how it contributes to individual agency and capacity to respond to both external pressures and change. As we've seen, you go back to school, but also you're responding to the fact that you may have lost your job in the lockdown, or that there are other issues with your family or your household or your individual accounts. More specifically, literacy affects individual capacity to process information. For example, as I've just mentioned, health, job opportunities, worker rights. Helen mentioned you're getting information through the door about COVID-19 and what you need to do, and you can't quite understand. You can't process the information, which is critical. You need literacy to make constructive decisions, to self-advocate, and ultimately feel greater life satisfaction, which was evident in those quotes. So what we're suggesting in the report, the approach we took, was to make a link between literacy, individual agency, which we have identified as the capabilities approach, and I'll talk about that in just a second, in areas of risk like health. So we advocate developing a shared across government departments, cross-government strategy that integrates this relationship between investment and capabilities, particularly literacy. We're using literacy as a proxy, and resilience, outcomes, and impact. So you're investing in individual agency, but you're measuring it through how much it affects a more collective resilience, knowing that Ireland is going to face numerous external shocks in the future. So resilience itself means, quote, trying to build safe fail systems capable of learning, self-organizing, and adapting to change. These systems could be interconnected, but they could be also affected differently by external shocks. So let's say you have a climate disaster, you have a hurricane. It may have a greater impact in certain areas like health and education, but not as much on others like local government authority. And we've seen the same situation with the pandemic here in Ireland. Resilience means having the infrastructure in place, and this includes education, in order to restore these services because of good preparation, government preparation, and policy. But it's not just improving, and that's where the concept of resilience is really interesting, particularly its use now in the pandemic. It means coming back better. It means improving services so that you're more prepared for the future, for future shocks. McKinnon and Derrickson argue that the conceptual appeal of resilience lies in its socially inclusive narrative that requires all sections, and this is a quote, all sections of the community, and not just policymakers serving the needs of privileged creatives or the elites, to foster permanent adaptability in the face of external threats. So again, it's this kind of how do you prepare the public for a volatile future, and not just a particular portion of the population, but how do you prepare the general public? And in that sense, literacy becomes a critical issue. So you may have heard the presidential candidate Biden, or in the UK, there's Biden's campaign has taken on the label Build Back Better. And then there's a group of hundreds of civil society representatives, the Church of England, and local governments that have taken on this campaign slogan of Build Back Better. And that was actually adopted from the UN Disaster Framework for Post-Disaster Resilience. And you can also, Trokara has also adopted that campaign for how to build back better. Again, it's using this concept of resilience. So in the report, what we're trying to do is provide a concrete way of using the concept of resilience toward literacy. So literacy enables resilience through building individual capability to act personally upon information regarding health, finances, job opportunities, public benefits, the environment, food choices, and so on. So literacy is also a foundational concept of the capabilities approach. So again, the government's investing in capabilities to get resilience outcomes. Amartya Sen, who's the Nobel Prize-winning economist, developed the capabilities approach. He viewed literacy in his approach is not commensurate with well-being and life satisfaction. Essentially, the capabilities approach involves understanding literacy as an indicator of whether or not a society is just in terms of promoting equality and combating social exclusion. Another proponent of the capabilities approach, who is also well known, the philosopher Martha Nussbaum, she recognizes literacy as a social good. It's not just an instrumental acquisition to enhance individual chances. She distinguishes between literacy for individual benefits, such as access to better jobs, and greater knowledge of rights. She viewed literacy as reflective of social values, where respect for individual dignity is paramount. So again, you have literacy, but it's not just okay, we're going to implement a literacy program in order to achieve better statistics. It's how do you invest in the capability of individuals to make better decisions, and by making better decisions, they enhance the collective good. And then there's a sense of it, everyone has individual dignity, and they're knowledgeable of their rights. So you have it's a sort of individual investment in the individual to uplift society. It means that literacy can facilitate critical thinking, which is an intangible quality that you can't sort of measure as part of an indicator, but it goes beyond a functionality. It's this focus that underpins the development of a healthier, more just and more democratic society. As we've seen all over the world, without critical thinking skills, you don't know how to process information, particularly information online, which can have damaging effects to democracy. To conclude, in more practical terms, with better literacy, citizens and residents can also effectively engage with public institutions. They can understand and act upon new information, such as regarding public health and policy changes. They can use technology, particularly in reference to digital literacy, and they can advocate for themselves and their communities in relationship to issues like climate change, access to public services, infrastructure, and human rights. So I keep repeating myself, by investing in the individual, you get more sort of stronger citizenship. You're investing in citizenship and the ability of citizens to respond to public policy, to engage with public institutions, but also, again, to make better decisions for themselves. And then to conclude, if we were to return to the challenges facing Ireland, which are pretty daunting, what we're looking at is the greater capacity to act upon information and use technology and understand how to respond to external events can help those particularly in economically and socially marginalized positions to better advocate, to understand what's facing them. And because those are the groups that have been most affected by the pandemic, it's particularly important that the government targets literacy as a skill necessary for those populations in order to make decisions so that they can make constructive decisions about the job market, about their health, about housing, and their futures. The pandemic alone has shown that it's really important for information for individual and society. So if there's a second wave in the future in this year, that it has to be accompanied by health literacy so that people understand the information they're getting. Beyond health, I think that we're also going to have to return to skill development, just to mention another policy issue for SME employees and managers who are going to need those kinds of basic skills in order to figure out where their position is, or if they or have any position in the future economically in Ireland. So just to conclude, the key is not reducing literacy to a policy objective, but rather envisioning literacy as both a right and a means of preparing the public to manage current and future conditions. In this way, literacy can become a cross-government policy approach and focused on preparing the country and enabling individuals. It's an investment in the future. And I will leave it there. Thank you again, Helen and Inez.
Great, thank you, Shane. That was really fantastic. I'm appreciative to you and your colleagues for the work that you've done on this report, and it's a big task to get such a brief summary of a lot of work, and certainly the report goes into this in a lot more detail and is a really interesting read, which I would encourage people to go to it. For the purpose of today, though, we really just wanted to whet the appetite in relation to what it is covering. And I think you'll see between the two inputs we've had so far that what we're trying to do, I suppose, is set a scene for looking at what we understand to be as I say, the current state of play, where Ireland is unfortunately not faring well, statistically anyway, in this area in relation to the average. We're below the average in the EU in this area. So we'd like to, I suppose, raise the ambition to meet some of the targets that do exist actually in things like the National Skills Strategy. But we believe in order to do this, there is going to be a requirement for a different approach and a more unified effort to build on the very real efforts and policy work that is being done by government departments, which we fully acknowledge and support, but are hoping to show how the synergies would actually achieve better for all. So I suppose to that end, I would like to move over now to some of our stakeholders who have joined us this morning. The first person I'm going to ask to say the words, and I'm conscious again, this is not a formal response we're asking from any government department. This is just an initial reaction, I suppose, to the fact we've concluded these reports now, and it's a long piece of work. We appreciate the fact that we're going into hopefully working in partnership with all of the government departments. Moving forward. So I have this morning the Principal Officer from the Department of Further and Higher Education. So hopefully I'm just going to hand over to Phil. Thank you for joining, and maybe if there's any thoughts at this point.
Thanks, Inez, and thanks a million to Shane and Helen. I'd read the documents, but to kind of see them presented in that way kind of gave a kind of an additional richness to things. I like the falling rocks image. When I'm driving, I never know what to do when I see that sign. I never know whether it's telling me to slow down or to speed up. But in this particular case, we'll take it as a encouragement to increase the pace rather than the opposite. It's probably important to note, obviously, as of a couple of weeks ago, myself and my colleagues are working in a new department with a new minister, so rejoicing in the name of the Department of Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Skills, which requires significant literacy to engage with in and of itself. in some ways, as I was kind of reflecting on the documents, I was kind of thinking about us as a new department as a bit like Ireland in terms of being a small open economy, because we are a relatively small department. We are quite a lot smaller than the Department of Education and Skills. And when we look at the sorts of areas that we're discussing today, it does for sure suggest that our reach and our influence and our really needs to go significantly beyond our own institution. So I suppose this sort of reconceptualization of literacy and numeracy and digital skills as something that is, more cross-governmental, it certainly kind of serves, I suppose, that sort of purpose. The Minister has shown a particular interest in this area. I suppose I'd say two things about that. Firstly, people will know how energetic he is in any case, and but he's been very keen in all his engagements thus far to kind of emphasise that he is the minister for the full gamut, all the way through from from transversal and basic skills provision, right the way up to the upper echelons of higher education. And he's been very visible and very vocal about further education and training, about literacy and numeracy, about digital skills in the series of meetings that he's been having with stakeholders, and he's meeting NALA next week, and in his more public utterances as well. As was said, the programme for government has the commitment to the 10-year literacy and numeracy strategy. So we've had to think a little bit about that. Clearly, last week the Minister launched and Solus published the further education and training strategy covering the next 5 years. I'm not going to go too much into the detail of that, because I'd imagine Roisin will have something to say about that. I mean, obviously that's a broad framework. Built around some of the things that we've been discussing today around skills development, around pathways, and around inclusion and participation. There is flesh to be put on the bones there, particularly in the areas of literacy and numeracy, and obviously and digital skills, and obviously the 10-year strategy gives us the opportunity to do that. Solus, as people may know, have a kind of a statutory responsibility in the area of literacy and numeracy, and my understanding is the Minister intends to write to Solus and very much with this cross-departmental vision in mind, around exercising that power in a way that draws together the various strands of literacy, numeracy, digital skills provision right the way across government services. So we intend to move forward on that front. Documents here today, they're hugely important contributions, and I mean, obviously I can't say until we've kind of crunched through the policy making kind of process that this is a formula that'll just be adopted. But I mean, it's a really important contribution. The research that's been done and the clarity of how it's been presented is very powerful. It makes a very strong case for investment in these areas, and obviously that's helpful from my perspective and from the perspective of the department. And that kind of broader concept of these areas of literacy, etc. I mean, it is very much in line with government's view. It is also, I suppose, very much in line probably with practitioners' views about the importance of these areas. I mean, they don't engage in intuition with learners in a vacuum. It is very much around the ability to engage, not just with government, but more generally and socially and in the context of work. It was interesting that Shaina mentioned the whole, pace of societal workplace change and how that's accelerated in recent years and looks like it's going to accelerate further. And it does pose questions for sure about issues of productivity, issues of career development, issues of well-being and participation. So we're looking at a world where businesses have to be more innovative, more agile, have to deal with things like digital transformation, and obviously this is a context that we've all in our own working lives been dealing with over the last number of months. So it is very connected to the world of work. It's very connected to other parts of the new department's remit in terms of the broader skills agenda, but also in areas like innovation and research. We need people to be fully equipped to engage in these areas, and I suppose the impact of the pandemic in terms of where it's impacted most strongly and where perhaps opportunities have arisen only builds the case for investment in transversal skills provision more strongly. The Build Back Better phrase kind of resonates a bit as well, because it's the minister said, he didn't use the phrase, but said something along those lines at the launch of the FET strategy last week. That it isn't just about getting back to where we were, but it's about creating something new, something different, and something better. So I think this is these are really important contributions to one of the parts of doing that. And finally, I'll just apologise on behalf of the government as a whole for so much departmental reconfiguration, whose primary focus, of course, was to mess up Helen's beautiful departmental map in terms of responsibilities for digital. So I'm sure somebody now is scurrying around to reconfigure that in the context of the new departmental setup. And in fact, I see Shaina had already done it in her final slide. So really looking forward to engaging across this agenda, change context for everyone, and looking forward to that. And thank you very much for laying it out so clearly.
Great, thank you very much, Phil. Really appreciate your time and those comments. And I know you're thinking about all of this, so I'm really hopeful that it's useful in the period ahead, and that it can definitely, I suppose, stir up the juices quite a bit in terms of doing things different. And I agree. I think the Build Back Better, doing things differently, is we have a good opportunity to do that now. That's great. Thank you very much, Phil. We're now going to move over to Roisin Doherty, who's the manager of active inclusion in Solus, who we work very closely with. So, Roisin, a couple of minutes just on your reaction. That would be great.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely delighted to be here today, and I suppose to share and discuss ideas with everybody. I suppose how we as a country can ensure all our citizens have the opportunity to develop critical lifelong learning competencies. And I suppose, when I was coming here today, I sort of was really thinking, how could we ensure the Build Back Better approach to what we do for the future. And it's great to have this opportunity today to really, I suppose, share ideas and start a discussion. And I'd particularly like to thank Nala and Task for the work that they've put into to allow us to start these discussions here today. And I'd like to also thank Nala for all their work over the previous strategy, the awareness campaign, the family learning, the numeracy, the guidelines for persons with intellectual disabilities to access the adult literacy services, which we commissioned Nala to do, and I'd like to thank you all for that work and help and assistance over the last 5 years. I suppose really I could talk for days, but because I've been working in this area for the last 5 years, and I suppose you're working with Phil in the department. We work across 40 government strategies with regard to inclusion. That's my particular area. And as I say, I could talk for days, but we don't have time for that. But I just want to touch on maybe a couple of different areas. I would like to touch on, why digital inclusion, but a lot of that has been covered already, so I'll not go into a lot of that. But I would like to maybe put forward just, I suppose, some frameworks that we might look at when we look at the new approach, particularly the EU key competency framework for lifelong key competencies. I'd like to look at that, and then other frameworks that we might possibly use that actually are very similar to what we've actually been talking about here this morning. And then just to finish off, and I suppose the motivation to learn. Everybody knows why you must learn, but is there motivation? What is the motivation to actually learn? So I suppose really, we're all fully aware, that the COVID-19 has shown us that key competencies, and in particular digital skills, is not just a career asset, but it's essential for supporting everyday activities such as online shopping, access to healthcare. And we all have our own examples. My mother's 85 and she can't access digital at all. You go to your local football ground and you hear parents unfortunately not being able to spell their own children's names. So we all have those lived experiences, and we all know, as Shannon said, we really have to move to the collective good in this whole particular area. So the lack of key competencies such as digital skills widens the digital divide between those who can access further education and those who cannot. Literacy, numeracy and digital skills is, as we've said, critical for productivity, competitiveness and social mobility. And we need to move to closing the digital divide and support communities across Ireland. And as Phil mentioned earlier, our new strategy was launched last week, Future Vet, Transforming Vet. And through that, we aim to address some of the key challenges we face, such as the digital divide, female participation and skills mismatch. And those are all particular areas. And as I said earlier on a tweet there, that there has never been a more pressing time to develop and implement digital transformation strategies across all policies and practice, and in particular working with learners, communities and businesses. So I'd just like to touch on just a particular model, and I'm sure you're all probably familiar with it, is that the whole area from Solis's perspective, and Phil mentioned with regard to our requirement under the legislation to promote, encourage and develop key competencies for lifelong learning. Because when I was looking at digital, I was then looking at literacy, I was then looking at English language. So I sort of summarised that into key competencies for lifelong learning for everyone, which emphasises equity and inclusion. And I suppose if we all aim to support adult learning for everyone, young people and adults, on issues such as digital skills, digital well-being, as Shannon touched on these, problem solving, critical skills, digital skills, personal, social and learning to learn competencies, English language, soft skills. These are all critical for citizens to fulfil personal fulfillment, have a healthy and sustainable lifestyle, have employability, have social inclusion, cultural awareness and citizenship. And I suppose that is all embedded in the EU Key Skills Framework for Lifelong Learning, and there's 9 competencies in that particular area. And I suppose the whole approach would be to ensure that those are embedded across everything that we do. And I suppose, how do you move forward from that high level? And I just a couple ideas again, maybe what frameworks we could use to support that. And again, it's what we've already been saying here this morning. There's an EU framework for Digicom, which looks at a framework for digital skills, and that's all available. And I know it's been piloted and it's been run in a number of further education and community and voluntary centres. The EU Entrepreneurial Competency Framework, and just launched this year, which I was absolutely delighted to see, was the Life Comp framework, which is a framework for, I suppose, validating your personal, social and learning to learn key competencies, and have all that documented in one particular place. Have that documented in your individual learning account, have your skills validated through micro-credentialing in the new system of Europass. And I had an opportunity to have a look at that system, and in that system all your learning can be documented. And it just isn't just the formative assessment that we're looking at. You could validate your skills that you obtain in your local community through voluntary work, through working with your family, and all those skills could be accredited into your micro credentials and be available for you, that you can show your impact of what you've done over your lifetime. And I suppose moving away from, as we'd said earlier, the idea of, this one exam that is going to validate your skills, that really you can record all your expertise at all stages of your life, not just when you return to education, but actually at all stages of your life. And that also through that system, it would be critical that we would have a wraparound service which would ensure that learners who wish to return to education have a wraparound service of consistency of learner supports. So that was my 2 ideas. I just wanted to finish off then really to, I suppose, mention something as well that Shaina had mentioned, actually, this public good and the social good. And it's all right saying to people, you need to do this training, or you need to upskill in this particular area, or you need to use digital. But what will be the hook that we will use to encourage people? What will be the engagement process that we will engage people to ensure that they ignite the love of learning, that it doesn't become a chore, that it's actually something you enjoy and that it's of interest to you? And I think that's going to be critical in our thinking as we go forward, that we ensure that there's multiple forms of engagement, multiple forms of representation, and multiple forms of how you can learn to your particular needs. And I suppose that would be building on the universal design principles. And I suppose just one little line, I suppose, where there's a crack for everything. And that's how the light gets in. So if you get the engagement, from a learner's perspective, then you can move forward. And just, I suppose, 2 final points. Solus is very much looking forward to working with our partners to help realise the ambitions of all learners. And we look forward to ensuring that there's a lifelong learning pathway for every learner, that communities are offered real value, and employers have access to a talent pool. And together, I hope we can all deliver on this ambition. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Roisin. Really appreciate that. And that's a very interesting, very specific, actually, kind of maybe frameworks that can be drawn from to look at how we can widen out access. I think that's one of the points really that you were making, that clearly it is difficult sometimes to engage people. Hence why we've really found our own engagement, as I'm sure ETBs and yourselves have, with the Department of Social Protection, who are our next speaker. So we have Paul Carroll, who's the Divisional Manager with the Department of Social Protection, up next. So I won't want to delay. I'm going to hand over to Paul to share some of his thoughts.
Hello, are you there? Hey, hi Ines, how are you doing? Many thanks for the invite. I agree very much with all of the earlier speakers. I only had a chance to speed read the document, which is kind of poignant in itself. But as Phil said, I think it's hugely important and warrants very serious and detailed consideration. That said, I had a kind of few initial comments. I note the very interesting perspective on not just taking a narrow educational focus, but rather, as Helen was suggesting, kind of recognizing the link between recognizing literacy as a barometer of equality, and as Shaina was saying, kind of recognizing that link between literacy and resilience. And its importance really in enabling people to fully engage with public institutions like my own, to use technology to look for better or alternative employment opportunities, certainly as the labour market changes due to automation and demands for evolving complex skills. Absolutely agree that addressing the digital divide is all the more important in response to wider societal and labour market changes, and indeed the post-COVID environment that we're living in at the moment. I also agree on the need to focus very much on measuring impacts. I think that that's going to be absolutely critical. I think the report gave a really good summary of the various strategies and policies and plans of the 9 government departments that are involved in adult literacy and numeracy. And note the view taken that those approaches are largely fragmented. and that there's lack of coordination, leading to your call, obviously, for a whole of government approach. And I think that I suppose, while far from perfect, I'd contend that there's perhaps a greater degree of coordination than the report would suggest. But that said, there's always a need for improvement. But in that regard, I think it's worth noting the reconstitution of the high-level group of the Department of Employment, Social Protection and Employment Affairs, and DES, and the Higher Education Authority and SULLIS, to provide oversight on that interaction between employment support services and education and training services. Absolutely agree on the need for responsive and creative approaches in supporting people, particularly unemployed adults, who need to improve their literacy, numeracy and digital skills. And in our ongoing work with SULLIS and the ETBs, we'll obviously maintain, and I think we need to heighten our focus on providing adequate and appropriate opportunities. As you know, we work very closely with yourselves in NALA, particularly in relation to using plain English in our communications with customers, and providing guidance and training to our frontline staff, and recognising customers who present with learning difficulties. As you know, we work very closely with yourselves, and as I can assure you of our commitment to maintain that very close working relationship as we move into the future. Hello.
Great, thank you, Paul. Sorry, you were even more swift than I had planned, so you can't.
What's rare is wonderful.
Yeah, you're better chairing than me in terms of keeping us on time. So thank you very much for those comments, and that's really, really useful.
You're welcome.
Paul.
You're welcome.
And I suppose we'll move on now to our final stakeholder input, which comes from what would have been one of the newest government departments until recently, but the Department of Rural and Community Development, which I got wrong way around the last time. We have Paul Geraghty, who we've been working with very recently. And we've been really encouraged by many of the ideas and discussions that we've had with Paul about how, I suppose, literacy and numeracy and digital skills and the support of their improvement within the client group that department is concerned with is very much, I think, at the forefront. So without more talking from me, I would hand over now to Paul Geraghty. We may not have a video, but we definitely have sound for Paul. So I'll hand over to him now.
I think I've discovered how to unmute myself. I hope you can hear me. Yes, I wasn't able to sort out the screen. Apologies, Inez. So when I tell you I ironed a shirt for the occasion, you'll have to take my word for it. Thank you very much. I'll be brief. I see that we're running up against the clock. Paul Geraghty, Department of Rural Community Development, with responsibility for the SICAP programme, among other social inclusion initiatives. As you know, with the aim of, I suppose, targeting and helping and bringing interventions to our most disadvantaged with locally based sort of individual and group interventions. So, you know, one of the key, I suppose, elements of the information supporting your three reports that 18% of Irish adults are at or below 1 on the 5-level literacy scale. And we would say that our target cohorts in respect to SICAP experience far higher levels of literacy and numeracy and digital difficulties than that, you know, creating sort of further barriers to their engagement with community life, employment and education and so on. So it's we very much welcome these reports which set out ways to sort of tackle those inequalities. The reports are very timely. You know, and particularly from our point of view, SICAP is delivered usually in a sort of a one-to-one intervention basis, or indeed sometimes in classroom settings for sort of training interventions. So we really need to think about new ways post-COVID as to how we'll be delivering those interventions. And I suppose digital literacy will be a huge element, a huge factor in that at both ends of the transaction, I might add. Not just our participants and our clients, but ourselves on this side of the delivery. we all need to sort of get up to speed with a new way of tackling exclusion in Ireland, so that we don't leave anyone behind. There's a lot of talk about recovery at the moment, economic recovery and so on, which is fine, but a just and a fair recovery for all is of paramount importance, I would suggest, and digital literacy, numeracy, and literacy will form the foundation stones of that. So look, I'll just say briefly, and I'm conscious of the time, I suppose, you know, let's taking, for example, the whole of government approach set out in the Literacy for Life report. I'm very, very supportive of all of the suggestions therein. Nala, we're invited to give a presentation to our interdepartmental that, and it's just bring that level of awareness to officials across all of the departments who are involved in the delivery of social inclusion in Ireland. Again, we're most appreciative and interested in the outcomes framework piece as well. It ties in very neatly with what we're trying to do in relation to a distance travel tool in terms of how we measure the efficacy of our own programs and interventions of PsyCAP in particular. We recognise that within that, as people move down a path of improvement in their lives, that, you know, their literacy and numeracy levels are key indicators of future opportunity and life chances. So we're very much aware of the key role that NALA can play in helping us, I suppose, helping us deliver our policy objectives and deliver our programs, helping us on the plain English side as well, which has been a really, really key of key importance to us over the last few years since we set up our department, and kind of de-jargonizing some of our literature. It's been very, very useful. It's been very, very instructive for us, and we try to bring those principles to what we do now. It's so that our documentation isn't exclusive. So that's been a tremendous intervention from Lana in relation to the way we do our business. So look, I could waffle on all day, but I'll just say, listen, look forward to engaging further with Nala. Many congratulations. Thanks to Inez, Helen, Claire, all the staff at Nala. Thanks to Shaina and everybody at Task who were involved in the reports. Fantastic work. We'll do our best to highlight them across government in every way that we can. So thanks, guys, and thanks for having me today.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paul. That was really nice. Thank you for saying that, and we really appreciate your support. And I think what's really important for us is that the new ideas and the work that we're trying to progress is of relevance, and you can see the relevance in the context of the work that you're doing in the Department of Rural and Community Development, and in particular to the clients who are being served through PsyCAP. So we're really heartened to hear that you'll find it useful and support our efforts in that regard. Our near final section is handing back over to my colleague Claire McNally, who's just going to give us a couple of minutes of a flavour of the kind of comments and questions that might be coming in. We're not going to go back to certainly to the stakeholders, and hopefully we won't need to go back to the speakers, but if we could just get a little taste from Claire, my colleague, of some of the questions and comments that are coming through. Claire.
I hope you can hear me okay. I just seem to have a little bit of a bandwidth issue there, but if anybody wants to ask a question, by all means put it into the question box there. Just one question, Inez, that came through is that, you know, 43% of people with disabilities have not gone beyond primary education, and I suppose what are the panelists' thoughts on what is needed to improve, you know, the literacy, numeracy and digital skills among people with disabilities, and ensure that programs and training are accessible to people with disabilities. So yeah, if anybody had any thoughts on that.
I suppose that we can, Roisin, I know you're there, if you want to come back in and just give a minute or two on that. Roisin, you're muted.
Beg your pardon, sorry for that. I suppose that's, and I'd mentioned it just when I was talking earlier there, to ensure that there is a consistency of learner supports available for all learners. And actually, we work very closely with the National Disability Strategy and the Comprehensive Employment Strategy, which has key targets and initiatives in place to support all learners, and in particular learners with disability, access further and higher education. And actually, we're working very closely with the head in putting in place a framework for universal design for learning. And actually, currently, there's up to 600 practitioners undertaking training on universal design as we speak. And in October and November, there will be up to 600 further practitioners undertaking the universal design digital badge. So I suppose we're moving to a framework approach where there are supports for individualized, and then I suppose trying to mainstream as many supports as possible, because you know, there's a range of different disabilities, and what supports one person will support all. So I suppose that would be critical to ensure the approach going forward will definitely support persons who require further support or individualised support. So it is a critical area that we're looking at across further and further education. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Claire, any other comments or questions briefly that we want to add in?
Yeah, I just would add in, and this is from Age Action, so obviously they're very pleased to see the whole of government approach, but they do bring up a good point in relation to looking at the evidence used for policy planning. Much of the data has traditionally been confined to, you know, 65 or 65 plus only, effectively omitting those over that age from being included or planned for. So is there any plans to widen this data collection and disaggregation for the older age cohort?
Well, I'll answer that briefly. Not that I understand there is, that essentially the OECD model is up to the age of 65, so that's the one that the Central Statistics offer. So I doubt it, but it's very important of the statistics to be cognizant of the fact that we know that there would be obviously more people over the age of 65 with literacy, numeracy and digital skills needs, for a fact, and also there are less in evidence in programs. So there is a particular challenge, I think, there that perhaps we're hoping that a whole of government approach could be more supportive towards. I'm not sure if any of the other panelists want to come in, but I would suggest that there won't be any change to the statistical piece, but it is possible to add in extra age. I think in Canada, for example, they added in an older age module, and it costs money. So I think it may be something to ask and see if it's possible to do in the future. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, the Adult Education Guidance Service, very much welcoming these reports, and you know, bring up the point just that they were very integrated into the literacy tab. Might need to revisit that. Just one question here about, you know, could you just define the digital skills? So the statistics that we have, you know, around 55% of low digital skills, could you just define those? What you mean by digital skills?
Well, I know in the PIAC work, it's predominantly based around a range of tests that are graded between low and high, 1 being low, 5 being high, and they are taken from everyday real life scenarios. So essentially, the literacy, numeracy and digital skills that are tested are effectively ones that people will find in their everyday lives, and they're graded as the sort of the lowest level of skill, if you like, right way up to 5, which is the highest. So in Ireland, we had predominantly scored at the lower level in relation to the digital competence. I'm not as familiar with the CDFOP tests, so I can't really comment on those, but I know that the PIAC ones which preceded it were as I described, everyday ordinary tasks that people would be expected to perform using a digital interface. Okay, Claire, anything else before we conclude?
Yeah, there's a couple of other comments here, and I think we might get back to those individually, just in relation to other strategies that can be referenced and that we can, especially in relation to the libraries as well. So we'll come back to those individuals because I'm conscious that we're kind of going over time now, but thanks very much everybody just for those questions and that input.
Great, thank you, Claire. Okay, I suppose really today our purpose was just to launch the documents, which is, as I said, a culmination of 18 months work, to get an opportunity to, in particular, I suppose, pass them on to important stakeholders who will have a greater statutory responsibility in relation to progressing the area, in particular in light of the Programme for Government Commitment for a New Strategy. We think they are very timely and very useful. We hope to be involved in that process. I suppose one of the things I would say is often with high-level groups these days, there doesn't tend to be as many non-governmental bodies involved. So I know that NALA currently isn't involved in any of those. So we'd love to be involved in any of the work and very much to support its progression, and we hope to be able to do that. For today, as I said, the documents are available. We're very happy to engage with anybody who wants to engage with us further in relation to them. We'll continue on working with those government departments and state agencies as we currently do on a pretty bilateral basis, and we're hoping to be able to do that now on a more of a whole of government approach. I suppose my final comment references the fact that we are very much trying to build on some of the great work that is already there, the great work being done at the front line by education and training boards and their staff, as well as the policy interface for the benefit of people that we have the privilege of working with every day, who tell us about, on the one hand, the challenges that they've had in their life as a result of not having basic skills, but also the huge transformation to their lives when they get these skills. The big challenge, of course, is how to bring it to them in a timely fashion, because we know we have low participation rates currently in programs. So part of the new approach is to think about new ways of bringing learning to people in the context that's most relevant to them. And perhaps in that regard, that's where the interdepartmental, interagency idea is particularly useful, so that we're actually supplying and supporting citizens in the place that makes most relevance to them. So not everybody is going to go back into a programme, but rather wants to have their literacy and numeracy and digital skills supported in a context that's most relevant to them in a timely fashion, and just enough. So just in time and just enough is certainly one of the things that we're exploring about how to do that, and in conjunction with other policies and providers that are actually working with people, so that we're not really putting another burden on people to come back into learning separately, but rather bringing the learning to them in a place and time that's of most relevance. That's a challenge. Technology, however, can I think help us in that regard. So we're certainly going to build on our own efforts there, and would really be pleased to talk about how that could be something that could be realised. I just want to finally thank my colleagues, Claire and Helen, in particular in NALA, who've done a huge amount of work on this. The stakeholders who've joined us this morning. I really appreciated putting you on the spot this morning and asking for a few comments was a bit mean of us, but I'm really pleased you were able to come along and contribute, and to the team in Task who've done, I think, an excellent piece of work. We really look forward to seeing the 10-year strategy in the next year, and seeing a new vision and a new ambition for addressing literacy, numeracy and digital skills in Ireland. Thank you for joining us this morning. Sorry we went a little bit over time, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.